She gave up everything, her dreams, her worth, her right to be loved, because one doctor's words convinced her she was broken. For 6 years, Elara Ashcroft lived like a woman already dead inside, working land that asked nothing of her and expecting nothing in return. Then a stranger rode past her fence line on a cold October morning, and everything she had carefully buried began clawing its way back to the surface, whether she wanted it to or not. If you've ever been told you weren't enough, that something missing inside you made you unworthy of the life you wanted, then this story is for you. Stay with us until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The fence post had been leaning since August. Elara Ashcroft knew it the same way she knew most things about her property. Not from looking directly at it, but from the corner of her eye, the way you notice a bruise you've stopped bothering to explain. She'd driven the replacement post into the hard earth 3 weeks ago, hauled it up from the supply shed herself, dragged it across 40 yards of frost-bitten ground on a morning cold enough to make her back teeth ache. But she hadn't cemented it, hadn't strung the new wire. The old post still stood at its crooked angle, leaning slightly southwest like it was pointing at something she didn't want to look at. She told herself she'd get to it on Saturday. Then Saturday came and she found other things to do. It was a Tuesday in early October when she finally carried the cement mix out and crouched in the dirt beside that post, working the dry powder into the hole she'd already dug, pouring just enough water to start the set. The morning was sharp and clear, the kind of autumn day that felt apologetic about what was coming. Too bright, too still. The mountains in the distance looking almost painted against the sky. She didn't notice it as beautiful. She noticed the ground was harder than expected and that she'd worn the wrong gloves. She was tamping down the mix with the butt of the post pounder when she heard hooves on the road. The county road that ran along the eastern edge of her property wasn't heavily traveled. A few ranchers used it regularly. Delivery wagons from Frost Hollow came through twice a week. Occasionally a drifter passed, looking at her fence line with the particular kind of measuring look she'd learned to recognize. Not admiring, just calculating. She'd gotten good at not looking up when horses went by. She'd gotten good at a lot of things that were mostly just ways of not paying attention to the world. But this horse moved differently. It wasn't the pace. Steady, unhurried, nothing unusual. It was something about the way the animal held itself, a kind of even-tempered attention in the gait, and the rider matched it, not slumped, not rigid, just there. Elara looked up despite herself. The man was probably somewhere in his mid-30s, lean in the way of someone who worked outdoors rather than someone who went without food. He wore a plain work jacket over dark wool, no hat despite the cold, and he had the reins held loose and low in a way that told her more about him in 3 seconds than most people revealed in 3 hours. She'd grown up around horses. She knew the ones who'd learned to hold a rein like a leash, tight, compensating, always slightly afraid of what the animal might do on its own. This man wasn't holding the rein, he was just keeping contact. He noticed her at about the same moment she noticed him, and he slowed. "Morning," he said. He didn't stop immediately. He let the horse come to a natural halt a few feet past the fence line, then turned in the saddle to look back at her. Not rude, not presumptuous, just conversational. "Morning," she said. She went back to tamping the post. She heard him sit there for a moment. Most men, when she didn't offer more, moved on. A few tried harder. 1 or 2 had dismounted without being invited and walked right up to the fence, like the distance between a public road and private property was a formality rather than a boundary. She'd learned to read the pause. This one didn't move. "That post giving you trouble?" he asked. "Had it for a while," she said. "Getting it done now. Ground's hard this time of year." "It is." Another pause, then, "You want a hand with the tamping? 2 sets of arms makes it go faster." She looked up again. He still hadn't moved toward the gate. Hadn't assumed. He was asking from the road, which was his side of the fence. And he was asking with the tone of someone who genuinely didn't mind either answer. "I'm fine," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once, the way men did when they actually heard you rather than just waiting for the end of your sentence. Then he touched the horse's sides lightly and moved on down the road. She watched him go for longer than she should have. His name was Gideon Mercer, and she didn't learn it that day. She learned it 3 days later from Hattie Pruitt at the dry goods store in Frost Hollow, When she went in for wire staples and lamp oil, and Hattie mentioned the way Hattie always mentioned things, sideways, with a little tuck of interest at the corner of her mouth, that a horse trainer had taken on work out at the Callaway spread 6 miles east. Comes well recommended, Hattie said, dropping the staples into a paper sack and folding the top with 2 crisp creases. Apparently he's got a reputation for the difficult ones, horses nobody else can settle. That right, Alara said. She wasn't particularly interested, but Hattie talked whether you were interested or not, and silence was as good as encouragement. Name's Mercer, Gideon Mercer. From up north somewhere, I think. Helena, or near there. Hattie set the sack on the counter. You'd have seen him going past your property. He takes that county road every morning. I may have, Alara said. She paid for her things and walked out into the cold. Mom. Alara had come to Frost Hollow 11 years ago with her father, who had not lasted 2 winters. The ranch had been his idea, his money, his dream, a late-in-life venture after a lifetime working other people's land in Ohio. She'd come along because she had nothing better to do, which was how she'd made most of her major decisions at 20, and which she no longer thought about too carefully. When he died, she could have sold. She probably should have sold. That's what people told her, or implied, or left hanging in the air between statements about how hard a single woman would find it. She kept it instead. Partly stubbornness, partly the fact that she'd put 2 years of her own labor into the place by then, and it had started to feel like hers in a way nothing had before. The ranch ran about 240 acres. She kept horses, 3 of her own, plus she took in boarders when neighbors needed winter stabling, and a small herd of cattle, never more than she could manage without hired help. She'd had a part-time hand for a while, a quiet Crow man named Samuel, who'd worked the property for 3 seasons and then moved on to follow family west. She hadn't replaced him, hadn't tried. She was capable. She knew that about herself without vanity. She could drive posts and string wire and read weather and pull a calf and ride anything that could be ridden. She'd learned most of it by necessity, which was the best teacher and the least forgiving one. And she had the hands to show for it, rough at the knuckles, permanently stained at the fingertips from working leather. What she was not capable of, or what she had decided she was not capable of, was wanting anything more than this. That decision had a date. April 17th, 6 years ago. She knew the date not because she'd marked it, but because some dates stuck in the body whether you wanted them to or not, the way a badly healed bone remembered cold weather. She'd been 25 and she'd gone to see a physician in Billings about pain she'd been carrying for almost a year, deep and irregular, the kind that announced itself at strange hours. The doctor, a Dr. Hale, whose face she no longer clearly recalled but whose voice she remembered precisely, had examined her for a long time, asked careful questions, and then delivered his conclusion in the practiced tone of a man who'd given bad news before. Miss Ashcroft, he'd said, I want to be direct with you. What I'm seeing here suggests significant scarring of the reproductive tract. I believe, and I want to be honest that certainty is difficult in these matters, but I believe you will find it very difficult, perhaps impossible, to carry a child. She had sat very still in his office while he continued talking. She hadn't cried until she was outside, in the street, in the October cold, standing next to the post where she'd tied her horse. Then she'd stood there for a while, one hand on the horse's neck, and cried in the way you cried when you needed to be very quiet about it. She wasn't sure, looking back, whether the grief had been entirely about children, whether she'd actually built strong dreams around motherhood, or whether the loss was more abstract than that, more about what the diagnosis meant for every other conversation she'd ever have, about what it closed off, about how it changed the math of everything. Either way, she'd ridden home and made a decision that felt, at the time, like the responsible one. She would not put that problem on anyone else. It was surprisingly easy, once she'd decided. She was already reserved by nature, and reservation made the rest simple. Men in Frost Hollow asked her to dances twice, maybe 3 times. And when she declined pleasantly, they mostly didn't push. When 1 or 2 pushed, she was less pleasant, and they learned. She developed a reputation as capable in private, which people in frontier towns generally respected because there were enough genuine eccentrics that a woman who kept to herself barely registered. She built her life in a way that didn't leave room for anything that required explaining. That was how things stood on the Tuesday morning she looked up from her fence post and watched Gideon Mercer ride past on a horse he held like a conversation rather than a constraint. He came past again on Thursday. She was in the paddock that morning, working with a bay mare named Duchess, who'd come to her 6 weeks earlier with a wicked flinch response on her left side. The kind of behavior that usually meant someone had hit the animal there, repeatedly, over a long period of time. Alara had been taking it slow. No rushing, no forcing, just consistent presence and patience, moving in small circles of trust that she extended by inches every day. She heard the horse on the road and didn't look up. "That mare come to you spooked?" he asked from the road. She glanced over. He'd stopped again, same position as before. Natural halt, not pressed against the fence, reins easy. He was watching Duchess with an expression of focused attention that had nothing performative in it, not showing off his knowledge, just looking. "She was," Alara said. "Left side." Left side. He watched for another moment. "You're doing it right," he said, just keeping company with her. "I know how to work a horse," she said. It wasn't defensive, just factual. "I can see that," he said, and he didn't sound chastened, just agreeable. "I'm Gideon Mercer. I work the Calloway spread." "I know," she said. Hattie Pruitt. He smiled at that. It was a real smile, not a charming one. It reached his eyes and also disappeared quickly, like he hadn't quite intended it. "She mentioned me. She mentions everyone." "I'm sure she does." He patted his horse's neck. "I'm sorry for interrupting your work. She's a pretty mare. She'll come around." "She will," Alara said. He nodded and moved on. Dit. The third time he stopped and asked if she had water. It was a genuine question. His horse had been working hard that morning. He'd pushed further down the ridge than he'd planned, and the creek crossing was another mile east. She considered saying no, the way she might have a month ago, the way she'd trained herself to answer unnecessary contact with unnecessary distance. She said, "Gates at the north end." He came through properly, latched it behind him, let his horse lead the approach to the trough, stood back while the animal drank, and didn't immediately start filling the silence with words. She was at the workbench under the overhang, replacing a cracked ferrule on a fence tool, and she kept working. After a while, he said, "You ever have trouble with the Calloway horses when you were starting out, before you knew your way around the county?" She looked up. "I haven't worked their horses. I meant coming to a new place generally, when you're new and you don't know the land yet." She thought about it. "First winter," she said. "I didn't know which draws flooded. Lost 2 days of work digging out a fence line I'd put in a bad location." He was quiet for a moment. "I put in a drainage channel last week in the wrong spot." Calloway didn't say anything, but I could see it on his face. "Is he a hard man to work for?" "He's fair, just precise. He knows exactly what he wants, and he's patient enough to explain it, which is more than most." She set down the tool. "You've worked for worse, much worse." He said it evenly, without drama, the way people said things that were true and didn't need embellishment. "There were a few years after I left Helena where I was taking whatever work came. Some of those men were the kind you'd work a full season for, and then spend the next one trying to unlearn what they taught you." She understood that. She didn't say so directly, but something in her posture shifted, just slightly, the way it did when a conversation moved from surface to something that had weight under it. His horse finished drinking and stepped back from the trough. "Thank you for the water," he said. He gathered his reins, led the horse back toward the gate, let himself out, latched it. "The same as coming in, careful, respectful of the boundary. Same time tomorrow," she said, before she'd fully decided to. He looked back. "If he needs water again," she said. "He usually does this route," Gideon said. "Thank you." He rode on. Alara stood at the workbench for a moment, holding the fence tool she'd already fixed, not doing anything with it. Then she went back to work. She didn't tell herself it was anything. That was important, not telling herself. The moment you named something, it became a thing that could be lost, and she'd learned a long time ago not to build expectations out of patterns that were still forming. He came past most mornings. He stopped sometimes. They talked about horses, about land, about the particular challenges of this stretch of frontier where the seasons changed hard and fast, and the ground had its own opinions about what you tried to do to it. He helped her with the fence post she'd never quite gotten right, not by taking over, but by asking if she wanted a second set of hands at a moment when she genuinely did. and then doing exactly the work she directed without reorganizing her methods. He hauled fence wire with her one afternoon for 20 minutes without it becoming an occasion. He noticed she'd been having trouble with a rusted gate hinge and asked, casually, if she'd tried a specific technique he'd used on an old hinge at the Calloway place. She tried it and it worked, and she told him so the next time she saw him. These were small things. She knew they were small things. But she'd been living in a world of large absences for long enough that small things had started to have a different weight. What she noticed most was what he didn't do. He didn't act like her land was his problem to solve. He didn't offer opinions about how she ran things unless she asked. He didn't look at her ranch with the particular expression she'd seen on the faces of men who were already calculating whether it could be improved under new management. He didn't crowd her. He didn't get louder when she was quiet. He didn't take her practicality for coldness or her silence for an invitation to fill it. He just showed up, consistently, without requiring anything of her, and then went about his day. She didn't tell herself it was anything, but she started waking up on mornings when the weather was bad and wondering if he'd still come past. Well, October deepened into November and the cold got serious. The light came later and left earlier, and there was a particular quality to the air in the mornings now. Clean and absolute. The kind of cold that simplified everything, burned off whatever was soft and left only what was actually there. She was in the barn one afternoon when she heard his horse, and she came out to find him at the gate, not riding through, just standing there with an expression she hadn't seen on him before. "You heard about the Delacroix place?" he asked. The Delacroix farm was 7 miles north. She'd bought hay from old Cornelius Delacroix 2 years running. She shook her head. "Fire," Gideon said. 3 nights ago. They lost the barn and a storage shed and 4 horses." He paused. "All their winter feed." She felt it land. Anyone in this country would. A barn fire in late October was a particular kind of catastrophe. Not just the loss of the structure, but everything inside it. And without winter feed, you were making impossible decisions before December. "Is the family all right?" "Everyone got out, but they've got nothing to stable the remaining animals and no way to feed them through the winter." He looked at her steadily. "I've been asking around. A few people are offering what they can spare. I didn't know if you might have room or feed to contribute." She thought about her stores. She'd put up more hay than usual this year. She always did, because she'd learned the hard way what an extra long winter could cost. And her stabling was full, but not overcrowded. "I can spare some feed," she said, "and I've got a paddock I'm not using. I can help transport it if you want." "Saturday morning," she said, "if the weather holds." "Saturday," he agreed. He didn't thank her extravagantly. He didn't make it into a story about her generosity. He just noted it and moved on, the same way he always did, treating her like someone whose decisions deserved to be received at face value rather than remarked upon. She stood at the gate after he'd gone and watched the road for a while, the afternoon light coming in low and amber across the pasture, and she thought, not for the first time, that he was a man who seemed genuinely comfortable with the world not being about him. That was rarer than it should have been. Saturday came cold and clear. He arrived at first light with a borrowed wagon, and they spent 3 hours loading feed from her loft and driving the 7 miles north to the Delacroix place, where Cornelius and his wife, Marta, met them in front of the ruined barn with the particular exhaustion of people who had been holding themselves together through emergency. Marta Delacroix hugged Alara so hard it almost hurt. "People have been so kind," Marta said, and her voice caught on the last word. After everything, I didn't know if people would—" "Of course they would," Alara said, which was the right thing to say and not entirely true, but Marta needed it to be true more than she needed accuracy. They unloaded the feed and spent another hour helping shore up a temporary shelter for the remaining horses. Gideon worked without commentary, taking direction from Cornelius about where things needed to go, lifting what needed lifting, not treating the work like a favor that deserved acknowledgement. On the drive back, they rode for a long time without talking. Then Gideon said, "You didn't hesitate." "Didn't think about it much," she said. "That's what I mean." She glanced at him. He was looking at the road ahead. "Marta Delacroix looked at you like you'd given her something she'd been afraid to ask for," he said. "She'd do the same for me." "Maybe," he said, "but that's not why you did it." She didn't answer. The horses moved steadily, breath clouding in the cold air, hooves quiet on the frozen ground. After a while, she said, "Why did you do it?" "Because they needed help and I had a wagon," he said. "That's all?" "That's enough, isn't it?" She thought about it. "It usually is," she said. They drove the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the ones before. It had something warm in it. Not romantic, not charged, just close. The kind you got between people who'd done something real together. When they reached her gate, he helped her unlatch it and then said goodnight and rode on east toward the Callaway spread. She stood at the gate in the cold and watched until he was out of sight, which was a thing she'd been doing more often without letting herself think about it too carefully. It was Hattie Pruitt who first said it out loud, because Hattie always said things first and let other people catch up. "You've been seeing Mercer," she said, not as a question, dropping a bundle of candles on the counter beside Alara's weekly order. "He comes past my property," Alara said. "He comes past your property and stays for 3 hours," Hattie said pleasantly. "Sometimes he helps with repair work." "Mm-hmm." Hattie wrote down the total without looking up. "He's a decent man, better than most of what comes through. You could do worse." "Hattie? I'm just saying. I know what you're saying." Hattie looked up then, and her expression was kind in a way that was sometimes worse than criticism. "You're allowed to have things, Alara," she said quietly. "You know that." Alara paid for her order and left. She drove home with the candles and the wire staples and the 2 pounds of dried beans in the back of the wagon. And she thought about what Hattie had said all the way down the county road, past the fence post that now stood perfectly straight and solid in the hard ground, past the gate she'd fixed with the technique Gideon had suggested. She thought about it, and then she put it away, the way she always did, in the place where she kept things that were true but not useful. The first real storm of the season hit on a Thursday in mid-November. It came faster than the weather signs had suggested. She'd been watching the sky for 2 days and thought she had another day at least, but the front moved quicker than expected, and by mid-morning the snow was coming sideways and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees in under an hour. She was in the middle of reinforcing the barn door latch when it hit hard, and she abandoned that project and focused on getting the animals settled and secure. She was checking water troughs in the second paddock when she heard someone at the gate. Gideon was on foot leading his horse, both of them coated in snow. He'd been on the ridge trail when the storm came in and the county road was already drifting over. He'd made the judgment call that her property was closer than the Callaway spread by nearly 2 miles. "I'm sorry to just turn up," he said. He was calm, not dramatic, but he was also genuinely cold. She could see it in the set of his jaw. "Get your horse in the barn," she said. "I don't want to put you out." "The horse needs to be warm and so do you. Get him in the barn." He did. She settled the horse in the empty stall beside Duchess, gave him water and hay and a quick check-over to make sure he hadn't taken any injury on the trail. Gideon worked alongside her without asking what to do, which she appreciated because there was nothing worse in a storm than having to manage another person at the same time as the animals. When the barn was settled, she said, "Come inside." The cabin was small and practical, built for warmth rather than comfort. One main room with a cooking area at one end and a table and 2 chairs and a reading chair near the fire at the other, with a sleeping area curtained off in the back corner. She'd lived in it for 11 years and she'd stopped seeing it the way visitors saw it, which was as sparse. To her, it was just organized. She put coffee on and he sat at the table with his wet jacket hung by the fire and his hands wrapped around a cup while the storm howled outside and the windows went white. "I should have come down from the ridge an hour earlier," he said. "Yes," she agreed. He smiled faintly. "You're not going to tell me it's fine." "It's fine. You made a mistake about timing. It happens. You're here now." She sat down across from him. "How bad was it on the trail?" "Icy on the upper section. The horse was sliding a little. I made the decision when he started moving sideways more than forward." He paused. "He trusts me enough to keep trying. I didn't want to use that up by pushing him somewhere dangerous." She looked at him across the table. The fire was strong now, working against the cold that pressed at the windows. And in the firelight he looked. She caught herself noticing how he looked and moved her attention sideways. "You want something to eat?" she said, "if it's not trouble." I was going to eat anyway. She made soup from what she had, dried beans and salt pork and some root vegetables from the cellar, and they ate at the table while the storm ran itself out against the walls of the cabin. He asked about the horses she'd worked over the years, and she talked about that more than she expected to because it was a subject she knew deeply, and he asked good questions, specific questions, the kind you only asked if you were actually listening. He told her about a horse he'd worked in Helena, a former racing animal with a fractured confidence, the kind of damage that didn't show in the body but ran through everything the animal did. He'd spent 8 months on that horse, he said. People thought he was wasting time. The horse eventually became the quietest, most reliable animal on the property. "You think that's what happened to Duchess?" she asked. "The trust got fractured?" "I think she learned that being touched meant pain," he said, "so she disconnected from it. It's not viciousness, it's just survival." He paused. "Some people do the same thing." The storm had eased to a steady fall by the time they finished eating. The wind had dropped. Outside, the snow was still coming, but gently now, and the worst of it had passed. She cleared the bowls and stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the white-covered yard. "You should stay," she said. "The road will be impassable tonight, and the trail certainly is. There's a cot in the storage room." "I don't want to—" "Gideon." She turned from the window. "The road is impassable. You'd be riding in the dark in a blizzard. Stay." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Thank you. I will." She made up the cot in the storage room. It was cold in there, but she had spare blankets and a small iron stove she lit before she went to bed, and said good night, and went behind her curtain and lay in the dark listening to the storm settle toward silence. She lay there for a long time, very still, thinking about nothing in particular, which was what she always told herself when she was thinking about something she didn't want to name. In the morning, the snow had stopped and the world was white and clear and very quiet. He made coffee before she got up. She came out to find a fire already burning and 2 cups on the table and him standing at the window looking out at the new snow on the mountains with an expression she didn't try to interpret. They drank their coffee. They didn't talk much, but the silence was fine. It was the same silence they'd built up over weeks of small conversations. Not empty, just resting. He left after breakfast, once the road had been broken enough to travel. He thanked her for the hospitality. She said it was practical, not hospitality. He smiled at that in the way she'd started to recognize, real and quick, there and then gone. She watched him ride away down the snow-covered road. Then she went and found the work that needed doing, the same as every morning, the same as always. But something had shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way she could point to, just the way a fence post shifts in newly set cement, settling, finding its angle, still before it holds, but somehow already changed from what it was before. She didn't think about what it meant. She worked until dark. The mountains around Frost Hollow had a way of keeping their own time, indifferent to whatever anyone at their base decided to want or fear. They'd watched people arrive and fail and try again, and sometimes, occasionally, build something that lasted. Alara Ashcroft had been at their feet long enough to know they didn't care about her plans. But she'd also been there long enough to know that the seasons came whether you were ready or not. And sometimes the most dangerous one wasn't winter. Sometimes it was the first warm day of a cold year when everything you'd buried started insisting on being noticed. The snow from that first storm melted inside a week, the way early season storms often did. Violent arrival, soft exit, leaving the ground darker and heavier than before. November settled into its working rhythm, and life on the Ashcroft Ranch continued the way it always had. Except that it didn't, quite. And Alara knew it even if she wasn't ready to say so. Gideon came past most mornings. Sometimes he stopped, sometimes he didn't. When he did stop, it was never for long. 20 minutes, maybe half an hour. And it was always for something real, a question about a horse, a piece of fence that needed a second opinion, news from the Callaway spread about feed prices or road conditions. He never manufactured reasons. That mattered to her more than she expected it to. She'd started leaving the north gate unlatched on mornings she thought he'd come through. She didn't examine that too closely. What she examined instead was Duchess, who had begun, slowly and without fanfare, to stop flinching. It happened the way real change usually happened. Not in a single moment, but in an accumulation of unremarkable ones. Until one morning, Alara ran her hand along the mare's left flank, and the animal stood perfectly still and exhaled. And Alara stood there with her hand resting on warm horsehide and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was tight. "She let you touch her," Gideon said from the paddock fence. Yesterday morning, first time. How long has it been? Since I got her? 8 weeks. He was quiet for a moment, watching the mare. You didn't push her. No point pushing something that isn't ready. He nodded slowly, then without any particular significance in his voice, he said, That's a hard thing to hold to. Most people can't do it. She glanced over at him. He wasn't looking at her, still watching Duchess. And his expression was just thoughtful. But the words had a second layer, and she heard it, and she chose not to respond to it directly, the way she often did when conversations brushed up against something she wasn't prepared to stand inside yet. She'll need more time before I put a rider on her, she said. Take all the time she needs, he said, and turned back toward his own horse at the fence. What? The trouble with Clay Renshaw started the way trouble with men like Clay Renshaw always started. Quietly, at a distance, with a smile that didn't mean what a smile was supposed to mean. Elara had known Renshaw by reputation longer than she'd known him personally. He ran the largest cattle operation in the county, a spread 3 times the size of anything else within 40 miles. And he'd built it the way powerful men often built things in frontier country, partly through hard work, partly through being willing to do what other men weren't, and partly through a talent for acquiring adjacent properties at moments when their owners were most vulnerable. He was in his late 40s, broad through the chest, with a face that had once been handsome and had curdled into something that was almost handsome, almost trustworthy, always slightly off. He'd come to her the previous spring with an offer on her land. He'd been polite about it, she'd give him that. He'd sat at her table and drunk her coffee and laid out numbers that were fair on paper, and when she'd told him the place wasn't for sale, he'd nodded pleasantly and said he understood and that the offer would remain open. The offer remaining open, she understood, was not generosity, it was patience. He came back in late November with a different approach. She was in the yard when he rode up. Not Gideon's quiet approach on the county road, but a direct line up her front track, the way men came when they'd decided the property was already partly theirs. He dismounted at the fence and called out to her, and she walked over with her arms crossed against the cold and waited. Miss Ashcroft, he said, with the particular warmth of a man who'd practiced warmth until it fit like a coat. I was passing through and thought I'd stop in, see how the place is holding up going into winter. It's holding fine, she said. Good, good. He looked past her toward the barn. I heard you had some boarders over from the Delacroix place after the fire. That was good of you. It was practical. I had the space. Still, he smiled. Generous woman. Always were. A pause, just slightly too long. I heard you've been seeing a fair amount of Mercer lately. She looked at him steadily. He comes past on the county road. More than that by some accounts. His tone was still pleasant. That was the thing about Renshaw. He never got unpleasant until he was certain it was safe to. He's a decent enough hand from what I hear. The horse trainers move around a lot. Hard life to build a real future on. Was there something you needed, Clay? Just checking in. He looked back at her directly. You know my offer still stands. I'd give you fair price, Elara. You've worked this place hard and you deserve to walk away with something real. Not just, he gestured vaguely, all this struggle. The place isn't for sale, she said. Same as last spring, same as she'd said every time. Something moved behind his eyes, brief and gone. Well, he said, you let me know if you change your mind. He left the same way he'd come, unhurried, confident, as though refusal was just a temporary condition on her part that time would eventually correct. She stood at the fence for a while after he'd gone, watching the track, feeling the particular unease that men like Renshaw always left behind them. Not fear, exactly. More like the feeling of a storm on the horizon, present, not arrived, requiring attention. The whispers started in December. She didn't hear them directly at first. She heard them in the way you heard things in a small town, in the slight hesitation before a greeting, in the conversations that stopped a beat too soon when she walked into a store, in the look Hattie Pruitt gave her one morning that was different from Hattie's usual look, more careful, more deliberate. It was Margaret Foss at the dry goods counter who finally gave it shape, not intentionally, but because Margaret Foss was not a careful woman. Elara came in for lamp oil and overheard Margaret talking to another woman in the fabric section, their voices low but not low enough. No mystery why she keeps to herself. When you know the whole of it, I'd heard something, but I didn't know if...
It's true. She can't have children. Never will be able to. That's why no man's ever stayed.
Alara took her oil from the counter and left without finishing her transaction. She drove home without thinking much. She did the evening feeding. She made her supper and ate it standing up at the kitchen counter, which she sometimes did when she was too restless to sit. She went to bed at the usual time and lay in the dark and thought about how the information had gotten out, which wasn't difficult to figure out. She'd told no one in Frost Hollow directly. She'd never told anyone in Frost Hollow directly. But she'd gone to a physician in Billings 6 years ago, and physicians talked to other physicians, and those physicians had wives, and the frontier was smaller than it looked. She thought about what it would mean now that the town knew. She ran through it methodically, the way she ran through any problem that required managing. People would pity her. Some would think less of her, in the way that people thought less of anything that couldn't produce what they considered its primary function. Some would be kind about it in ways that were almost worse than unkindness. And anyone watching her and Gideon, and people had clearly been watching, would now be calculating what that meant, what she was worth to a man who might want a family. She thought about Gideon. She lay very still in the dark and thought about him carefully, the way she might examine a structural problem with the ranch, all the angles, all the load points. He was 36 years old. He was a man who was, as far as she could tell, genuinely good in the ways that mattered. Not performing goodness, but actually constituted that way, by temperament or experience or some combination of the two. He had not, in all the weeks she'd known him, said anything that indicated children were important to him, but that didn't mean they weren't. A man who was 36 and building a life in frontier country. Of course children were something he'd think about. Of course they were woven into the picture of a future, the way they were woven into everyone's picture of a future without anyone quite deciding to put them there. She had nothing to offer him in that regard. She had never had anything to offer him in that regard. What she'd been doing these past weeks, allowing this, letting these mornings accumulate, leaving the gate unlatched, it was irresponsible. Not just to herself, but to him. She'd been indulging something she had no right to indulge, letting a man spend his time and his consideration on a woman who couldn't give him what men eventually required. She'd been selfish. She could see that clearly now. The decision came easily, the way the first one had 6 years ago, because she'd had practice at this, at finding the clean line, the responsible choice, the door she could close before anything got through it that couldn't be taken back. She would pull back. Gradually, reasonably, without drama. No explanations, because explanations would require conversations she couldn't have. Just distance, slowly reasserted. Let the mornings become less frequent. Let the gate stay latched. Let the pattern dissolve the way patterns did when you stopped feeding them. It was, she told herself, the right thing to do. It felt like pressing on a bruise. Stick. She started the next morning. When she heard his horse on the road, she didn't come out of the barn. She stayed inside, checking the tack she'd already checked, making herself busy with her hands. She heard him slow at the gate she'd left latched, and pause, and then continue on. She stood in the barn and listened to his horse's hooves fade down the road. She did the same thing Thursday, and the following Monday, when he came around mid-morning and she was in the yard and had no way to avoid seeing him without making it obvious. She was civil and brief. She had work to get to. The north pasture fence needed attention. She couldn't stop. He accepted it without pressing. He said he hoped the fence wasn't too much trouble. She said it wasn't. He rode on. She watched him go and felt something she didn't have a clean word for. Not regret, exactly, because regret implied she'd had a different choice. More like grief, which was familiar territory. She knew how to carry grief. She'd been carrying it for 6 years. She went and fixed the fence, which didn't actually need fixing. And she worked until her arms were tired, and then she worked a while longer, because the work was the one thing that had never asked her for anything she couldn't give. The change in town was harder to manage than the distance from Gideon. People in Frost Hollow were not uniformly cruel. Most of them weren't cruel at all, in the way that most people weren't cruel when you looked at them individually. But collected into a community, given a piece of information that was a little strange and a little sad and a little different, they did what communities did. They organized it into a story, and then they lived inside the story. And the story said that Alara Ashcroft was a woman to be pitied. She could feel the pity when she walked into the general store. It was in the softening of voices, The extra care people took with her, the slightly too deliberate cheerfulness of women who'd never been particularly cheerful with her before. Mercy Aldane, who ran the post office and had always been brusque and businesslike, and whom Alara had respected for it, suddenly started asking how she was doing with a weight on the words that hadn't been there before. "I'm fine," Alara said.
Of course, Mercy said. You're so capable. It's remarkable, really, what you manage all on your own. It was the all on your own that lodged under her skin, the implication that her aloneness was now explained, contextualized, given a cause. She'd been alone because she couldn't have children. That was the story. Everything she'd built, everything she'd chosen, reduced to a consequence of damage. She drove home from town faster than necessary. She thought about Renshaw. It wasn't difficult to trace. He'd known her long enough, had connections broad enough, and he'd had motive. If the town decided she was a woman who couldn't give a man a real future, then her land became something slightly different. Not the ranch of a woman who'd built something. The ranch of a woman who was living on borrowed time, waiting for the inevitable surrender. She couldn't prove it, but she didn't need to prove it to know it. Yet, Gideon noticed the distance. She knew he did because he was not a man who failed to notice things, and she knew it specifically because of the way he stopped stopping. Not dramatically, not all at once, just a gradual mirroring of what she was doing. If she was pulling back, he wasn't going to push, and she'd understood from the beginning that he was that kind of man. He wouldn't demand explanation. He wouldn't manufacture reasons to force contact. He would simply take her behavior at face value, because he respected her enough to believe she knew her own mind. That respect right now felt like its own kind of hurt. She was in town on a Wednesday in mid-December when she saw him for the first time in almost 2 weeks in a context outside the road past her property. He was at the feed store, talking to old Tom Garrett about winter hay prices, and she came in for a bag of oats and saw him before he saw her. She had a moment, just a moment, where she could have turned around. She didn't. "Alara," he said when he noticed her. Neutral, warm enough. Nothing complicated in it. "Gideon," she said. Tom Garrett looked between them with the specific attention of a man who'd heard things and was now comparing them to evidence. "How's Duchess?" Gideon asked. "Good. She's been good." She picked up her oats from the counter. "She let me saddle her last week. Didn't ride her, just got her used to the weight of it." "That's real progress." "It is." The conversation stopped there because there wasn't anything else they could say with Tom Garrett listening, and maybe because there wasn't anything else either of them knew how to say at all right now. She paid for her oats and said goodbye and left. On the street outside, she put the oats in the wagon and stood there for a moment in the cold, her hands resting on the wagon rail, looking down the length of Frost Hollow's main street with its 2-story false fronts and its winter-empty boardwalks. Behind her, she heard the feed store door open. "Alara." She turned. Gideon had followed her out. He was standing in the doorway, one hand on the frame, not quite crossing onto the street. "Have I done something?" he asked. Direct. Not accusatory, just direct, the way he always was. "No," she said, "because something changed, and I don't know what it is, and I'd rather know than not." She looked at him. The street was quiet, but not empty. A woman across the way was sweeping her porch, moving slowly, not looking at them too obviously. "Nothing changed," she said. "I've had a busy stretch." He held her gaze for a moment, and she could see he didn't entirely believe her, and she could also see he was going to accept it anyway, because he wouldn't push, and she knew he wouldn't push, and she'd counted on that. "All right," he said. "I'll see you on the road," she said. "You will," he said, and went back inside. She drove home. She told herself she'd done the right thing. She told herself it clearly and simply, the way you had to tell yourself things when they cost something. She wasn't sure she believed it. Christmas came and went. She spent it the way she spent most things, working in the morning, reading in the evening, making a meal that was slightly better than her usual ones, as a small acknowledgement that the day was different. Hattie Pruitt had invited her to a gathering, and she'd declined, and Hattie had let her decline without pushing, which meant Hattie probably knew most of what was going around and was choosing her moments. The new year came in cold and hard. The days were short, and the work was long, and she kept her head in it, the way she always had, the way that had always been enough. But she was aware, in a way she couldn't quite shut off, of the county road out past her eastern fence, of how often she heard a horse on it, of how often she looked up.
She saw him twice more in January, said, once at the post office, once at the edge of a small community gathering at the schoolhouse that she'd attended briefly for the practical reason that it was where the road committee posted weather and supply updates for the winter. Both times they were civil. Both times the conversation was short. Both times she watched him walk away and felt that same unnamed thing pressing against her sternum that she'd been feeling since December.
She was managing. She told herself she was managing. Then one night in late January, she was doing the last check of the evening, walking the paddock fence with a lantern, the night cold and absolutely still, the kind of stillness that came right before weather changed. And she stopped at the north gate and stood there in the dark with her lantern and admitted something to herself that she'd been refusing to admit for 2 months.
She missed him, not in an abstract way, in a specific, present, daily way that had settled into her life the same way his visits had, quietly, incrementally, until it was simply part of the shape of every morning and every evening, an absence that took up exactly as much space as the presence had. She missed the particular silence between them. She missed the way he asked questions. She missed the way he moved through her property. Careful, respectful, as though every inch of it mattered because it mattered to her. She missed the morning he'd made coffee before she got up. She missed the drive back from the Delacroix place, the snow on the mountains, the silence that had something warm in it. She stood at the gate and held the lantern and looked out at the dark road and let herself feel all of it, which was something she almost never did. Let herself feel the full weight of something without immediately organizing it into a manageable shape. It was a mistake, she still believed. It was irresponsible. It would lead somewhere she couldn't follow. But it was real. She couldn't pretend anymore that it wasn't real, and that complicated everything. In the distance, the sky along the northern ridge had gone the particular shade of heavy gray that meant weather. She'd need to check the barn doors, bring in extra water before the pipes had a chance to freeze, get the horses settled for whatever was coming. She turned back toward the barn and went to work. The storm was still building on the horizon. She could feel it coming in the air, the particular pressure of it, the weight. She'd weathered worse. She wasn't entirely sure that was still true. The storm she'd felt building on the northern ridge arrived 4 days later, and it arrived the way the worst ones always did. Not gradually, not with the courtesy of building slowly enough to prepare for, but all at once, a wall of white and wind that came down out of the mountains in the early afternoon and turned the world into something that had no edges. Elara had been through enough winters to know the difference between a storm you managed and a storm you survived. This one was the second kind. She'd gotten the animals in by noon when the sky went wrong, that particular greenish gray that meant serious business, and she'd spent the next 2 hours reinforcing the barn doors and filling every container she had with water before the pump froze. She brought in extra firewood, stacking it inside the back door until there was barely room to walk through. She checked the windows for gaps and stuffed old rags along the bottom of the exterior doors and did all the things she'd taught herself over 11 winters, efficiently, without panic, because panic was expensive and she couldn't afford it. The snow started at 2:30. By 3 o'clock, she couldn't see the barn from the cabin window. She was at the fireplace feeding in another log when she heard something at the door. Not a knock exactly, more a series of heavy impacts like someone hitting the wood with the flat of their hand rather than the knuckles. The kind of sound you made when your hands weren't working the way they should. She opened the door. Gideon stood on her porch, coated so thoroughly in snow he was nearly white from shoulder to boot. His horse was behind him, head down and blowing hard, both of them leaning slightly against the wind. Her first thought was not surprise. Her first thought was the ridge trail. He'd been on the ridge trail again, same as November, and the storm had moved faster than either of them expected. Her second thought came quickly behind the first. He'd come here. He could have gone to the Callaway spread. She didn't know the exact distance, but she knew it was possible. And he'd come here instead. She stepped back from the door. "Get inside," she said. "I'll take the horse." "You don't need to. You can barely stand up." "I'll take the horse." She took the reins from his stiff hands and led the animal around to the barn, fighting the wind the whole 40 yards, the snow hitting her face like thrown gravel. She got the barn door open against the pressure of the gusting and got the horse inside and worked quickly. Unsaddled, rubbed down, water, hay.
The animal was cold but not in danger. Good, strong horse, had been well cared for. She spent 15 minutes on him and then pushed back out into the storm and fought her way back to the cabin. Inside, Gideon was standing at the fireplace with his wet coat on the floor beside him, holding his hands toward the heat, with the careful attention of a man who knew what cold hands meant and was taking it seriously. He'd tracked snow across her floor in a trail from the door. He didn't look embarrassed about it. "Sit down," she said, shaking snow off her own coat. "I'm all right." "You're not. Sit down." He sat. She made coffee and brought it to him, and he took it with both hands and said nothing for a while, just drank. And she let him, because sometimes a person needed a few minutes to come back into themselves after the cold had gotten into them. The storm outside was extraordinary. She could hear it in the chimney, a deep, continuous sound, less like wind and more like pressure, the whole cabin feeling slightly smaller under the weight of it. The windows were solid white. "I left too late," he said finally. "You did. I thought I had more time." "You didn't." He looked up from the cup. Something moved across his face, not quite a smile. "You're not going to let me off easy. You made a mistake. Doesn't mean you're not allowed to be warm." He nodded. He looked back at the fire. She sat in the chair across from him, the same positions they'd been in that first storm night in November, the table between them, the fire doing its work. She watched him come back to himself by degrees, the color returning to his face, his posture easing, his hands finally relaxing around the cup. Then he said, without looking up, "I've been trying to figure out what I did." She knew immediately what he meant. "You didn't do anything," she said. "Then why—" "Gideon." He looked up. "You didn't do anything," she said again. "That's the truth." "Then what happened in December? Because one day we were—" He stopped, reconsidered. "Something changed. I'm not asking you to apologize for it. I'm just asking you to tell me what it was." The storm pressed against the cabin walls. The fire shifted and sent up a small shower of sparks. Outside somewhere, something, a shutter she hadn't secured properly, was banging in an irregular rhythm against the side of the cabin. She looked at him for a long time. She'd been carrying the script for this moment for 6 years. She knew exactly what came after the telling, the careful expression, the considered pause, the withdrawal that tried to be gentle. She'd imagined it so many times it had almost become a memory rather than a fear. She knew the shape of it. But she was 31 years old, and she was tired. She was tired of carrying the script. She was tired of preemptively writing other people's endings for them. She was tired of making the responsible choice in the dark where nobody could see it and calling that enough. "There's something I haven't told you," she said. He waited. 6 years ago, I went to a physician in Billings. For pain I'd been having for about a year. She kept her voice level. Facts first. Keep it factual. He examined me and told me he believed I would never be able to carry a child. Significant scarring, he said. He wasn't certain. He told me he wasn't certain, but he said the likelihood was that it was permanent. Gideon said nothing. His expression didn't change immediately, just stayed present and attentive, the way he was when he was actually listening. When the town found out, she stopped, tried again. Someone talked. I don't know exactly how it got out, but it's out. People know. And I could see what was coming, what people would say, what they'd think about you spending time here, and She felt the words getting harder to manage. I thought it was better to step back before it became something it couldn't come back from. Before it became something I couldn't come back from, he said quietly. Not a correction, a clarification. Yes. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she heard the shutter banging, heard the wind shifting pitch, heard one of the horses move in the barn 60 feet away through the walls of the storm. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes. Did you think about asking me what I thought about it? She met his eyes. I thought I knew. You thought you knew what I'd think. I thought I knew what any man would think. He looked at her steadily. Something was working behind his expression. Not hurt, not anger. Something more complicated. I'm not any man, he said. It wasn't arrogant, it was just factual, the same tone he used for everything else that was simply true. And I think you know that by now. Gideon, I'm not finished. He leaned forward slightly, both elbows on the table. I want to tell you something, and I need you to hear it and not organize it into something it isn't. He paused. I'm 36 years old. I've been working other people's ranches for 14 years. I've had one serious relationship, and it ended because I couldn't stay in one place, and she couldn't wait for me. And both of those things were true, and neither of us was wrong. I have never in my life looked at a woman and thought first about children. I have never built a picture of a future that started with children. That is not— He paused again, searching for the right words. That is not the thing that makes someone worth staying for. She was very still. What makes someone worth staying for, he said, is whether you want to be in the same place they are. Whether the way they move through the world is something you want to watch for the next 30 years. Whether they're the person you want to be in the room with when things go wrong. He looked at her directly. You're that person for me. You've been that person since October. I'm not going to pretend I haven't known it. She found her voice. You don't know what you'd be giving up. I know exactly what I'd be giving up, he said. I've thought about it. I'm not walking in here blind. A pause. Are you? The shutter banged twice. The fire crackled. Snow hit the window like sand. I don't know what I'm walking into, she said honestly. Neither do I. That's true of everything. He leaned back, some of the intensity easing, but not the directness. Alara, I'm not asking you to make me any promises tonight. I'm not asking you for anything except to stop deciding what I think before you ask me. She looked at him for a long time. She felt the script she'd been carrying around for 6 years, all those careful, responsible, preemptive words. She felt them losing their shape, like paper in water, the edges going soft. I've been very careful, she said, for a very long time. I know you have. I'm not sure I know how to stop. I don't think you have to stop all at once, he said. I think you just have to stop tonight. The storm was extraordinary, and the cabin was very small inside it, and they sat there across the table from each other with the fire between them, and outside the world had disappeared entirely into white. She said very quietly, I missed you. When I pulled back, I missed it. He said, I know. I missed it too. That was enough. It didn't resolve everything. She could feel all the unresolved edges, all the things that would need working through in the daylight, in the actual world with its actual complications. But it was enough for now. It was true, and it was said, and it was between them. Neither of them moved toward the other. They sat at the table and finished their coffee, and after a while Alara got up and started supper, and Gideon asked if he could do anything useful, and she handed him the bread knife and the loaf she'd baked 2 days ago, and they worked in the small kitchen in companionable nearness, and the storm went on and on outside. Later, after they'd eaten, she sat in the reading chair and he sat at the table with a piece of leather he'd been working on, a braiding project he carried in his saddlebag. She'd noticed it before but never asked about it. And the fire burned low and steady, and the storm did its worst outside the walls, and neither of them felt the need to fill the silence. At some point he said, without looking up from the leather, the physician told you he wasn't certain. He said it was unlikely, she said. Not impossible, but unlikely enough that he wanted to be direct with me. 6 years is a long time to carry something uncertain. It felt certain enough to carry. He was quiet for a moment. That's the part I want to understand, he said carefully. Not the diagnosis, the decision you made afterward, the part where you decided what it meant for everything else. She considered that. I'd been told I was broken, she said. I didn't want to put that on anyone else. You're not broken. I know that, she said. Now, mostly. She pulled her knees up slightly. At 25, sitting in a doctor's office in Billings in October, I wasn't entirely sure. And now? She thought about it honestly. I think I've been using a 25-year-old's answer to a question that keeps changing. He looked up from the leather. His expression was quiet, attentive, not pitying, not triumphant, just there. That's a hard thing to figure out about yourself, he said. I've had a long night, she said. He smiled at that. The real one, quick and gone. You have, he said. She went to bed eventually, and this time when she lay in the dark, she didn't lie still pretending not to think. She just thought clearly, without fighting it, about the 6 years, about what she'd done with the diagnosis, not just carried it, but built with it, constructed a particular kind of life around it, used it to explain and justify and pre-decide, about whether any of that had actually been protecting herself or whether it had been something less honest than that. She didn't arrive at clean conclusions.
That wasn't how her mind worked and never had been. But she was awake in a different way than she'd been for months. Awake in the way of someone who'd put something down they'd been carrying so long they'd stopped noticing the weight. In the morning, the storm had passed. The world outside was white and absolutely silent. The kind of silence that came after extreme weather, the air washed clean and the light painfully bright off the new snow. She came out to find him already at the fireplace, coffee on, staring at the flames with his hands loose between his knees. Same as November, but different. "It stopped," he said. "It did." She poured coffee and sat down at the table, and they looked at each other in the morning light, both of them slightly changed from the night before in ways that were real, but not yet fully understood. "The road will be passable by mid-morning," she said. "Probably. You'll need to get back to Callaway." "I will." He paused. "I'll come by tomorrow, if that's all right." She looked at him. She thought about the gate, the north gate, the one she'd started latching back in December, the deliberate closing of a small opening. "The gate will be unlatched," she said. Something in his face settled, not dramatically, just settled, the way a horse did when the tension left. A small, real ease. "All right," he said. They drank their coffee. The morning light came in off the snow and filled the cabin with a whiteness that was almost too much, and outside the mountains were perfectly clear against the blue sky, every ridge and outcrop sharp as a cut, the whole visible world remade. She was not a woman who believed that storms solved things. She'd lived in this country long enough to know that weather was just weather, that it didn't have intentions, that the world that came after a blizzard was the same world as before, just rearranged on the surface. But she'd said true things the night before that she'd never said to anyone, and he'd said true things back. And sitting in the morning light across the table from him, she was aware that something had changed that couldn't be unchanged. Not just the ground between them, but something in herself, some posture she'd held for so long it had started to feel like her actual spine. She was aware, for the first time in 6 years, that the future was not a fixed thing. That was terrifying. She didn't pretend it wasn't. But it was also, underneath the terror, something she hadn't felt in longer than she could accurately remember. It felt, cautiously and with full awareness of how badly she was at naming things like this, like the first day in a long time that she'd woken up and found herself actually curious about what came next. She didn't say any of that out loud. She drank her coffee and looked out at the snow-covered mountains and let it sit inside her where it was still private and still hers, and that felt right for now. Some things needed a little more time before they could bear the weight of words. The gate stayed unlatched. That was how February began, with a small, deliberate act that cost nothing on the surface and meant everything underneath. Gideon came past most mornings the way he had in October and November, before December had interrupted things, and the rhythm rebuilt itself without either of them making a formal announcement about it. There was no conversation that started with, "So this is what we are now." There was just the gate, and the mornings, and the slow return of the particular ease that had been there before she'd taken it away. Things were different, though, not loudly different, but the storm night had moved something between them that couldn't be moved back, and neither of them tried. He stayed longer now when he stopped. The conversations went deeper without being dramatic about it. She told him things she hadn't told people, small things, mostly, but specific ones. The kind that were only small if you didn't understand what it cost a private person to offer them. He did the same. She learned that he'd grown up on the eastern edge of Montana in a house that was cold in 3 of its 4 seasons and in which nobody talked about anything directly. She learned that he'd left at 19 and that leaving had cost him a relationship with his father that had never entirely recovered. She learned that he cooked well when he had a proper kitchen and that he read when he could get books, and that he had strong opinions about horses and almost no opinions about anything else. She wasn't sure when exactly she stopped waiting for it to go wrong. Somewhere in the middle of February, probably. Or maybe she didn't stop waiting. Maybe she just got tired of the waiting and decided to be in the present instead, which wasn't the same thing but worked well enough. Duchess was riding now. Not far, not long sessions, but carrying a rider without the full-body anxiety that had been in her since the beginning. Alara took her out on clear mornings, easy loops around the paddock, letting the mare set the pace in the distance. It was coming. She could feel it the way you felt the approach of a thaw. Not certain yet, but probable. The conditions moving in the right direction. She told Gideon about it one morning, and he listened and then said, "What changed for her, do you think? The actual thing that shifted?" Alara considered it. "She stopped expecting the bad thing," she said. He nodded slowly, not saying anything else. She understood that he wasn't only talking about the horse. The winter market happened the second weekend of March, when the worst of the cold had technically passed, but the world still looked like February. Gray and packed snow and grudging, the streets of Frost Hollow turned to brown slush by the foot traffic of ranchers and families coming in from all corners of the county for the last big gathering before spring work consumed everyone. Alara went every year. Not for pleasure. She wasn't a woman who went to markets for pleasure. But because it was practical, because there were supplies to buy and prices to compare and people to talk to about seed and equipment and the general condition of things. She'd gone in years when she dreaded seeing anyone, and years when she hadn't thought about it much either way. This year she'd thought about it more than usual, because this year Gideon was going. He'd asked matter-of-factly whether she'd want to drive in together. The Callaway spread was closer to Frost Hollow than her property, and the roads were easier from that direction, but he said he'd come around her way if she wanted. She said yes before she deliberated about it, which was unusual enough that she noticed it. They drove in on Saturday morning, the wagon loaded with a few items she was selling, some tack she'd repaired and had no use for, a saddle she'd outgrown. The drive took 40 minutes, and they talked through most of it, which was easy now in a way it hadn't been at the beginning. The conversation moving between practical things and less practical ones without the seams showing. She was aware, when they came into town and people saw them together, of the looks. She'd prepared herself for that, or thought she had. The reality was slightly different from the preparation. It wasn't hostile, mostly. It was something more complicated than hostile. Some people smiled in a way that was genuine. Some smiled in a way that was performing something for other people nearby. A few looked with the particular expression she'd come to think of as the pity calculation. Measuring her against Gideon, measuring what he might not know, measuring whether his being with her was generosity or ignorance. She kept her shoulders square and her face neutral and let Gideon's presence beside her do what it did, which was make the calculations of other people feel slightly less relevant. They set up her selling table near the south end of the market, and he helped her arrange the tack without being asked how she wanted it arranged, which she appreciated. He spent the first hour walking the market while she managed her table, and she watched him from a distance. The way he moved through the crowd, unhurried, stopping to talk to people with the same quality of attention he gave to everything. Not performing sociability, but not avoiding it either. Hattie Pruitt came by the table mid-morning and looked at the two of them with the expression of a woman who was containing considerable satisfaction. "You look well," Hattie said to Alara. "I'm fine," Alara said. "Better than fine." Hattie bought a pair of leather reins she probably didn't need. "He's a good man." "I know," Alara said. "You're allowed to know it out loud," Hattie said, and moved on. Gideon came back with coffee from the vendor at the market center and handed her a cup without comment, and she took it, and they stood at the table together in a way that was unremarkable and also quietly significant, and she was aware of both things at once. It was going fine. She was letting it go fine. Then Clay Renshaw appeared at the edge of the market. Yet, she saw him before he saw her, or before he chose to let her know he'd seen her, which with Renshaw wasn't necessarily the same thing. He moved through the market crowd with the ease of a man who'd never doubted his right to take up space anywhere, stopping to talk to 3 or 4 people near the north tables, laughing at something one of them said, clapping a man on the shoulder, working the room the way he always worked any room, building his presence in increments, the way you built a fire. When he finally turned toward her table, she had the feeling that he'd been aware of where she was the entire time. "Alara," he said, approaching with the same easy warmth he'd had every time. Then he looked at Gideon. "Mercer." "Renshaw," Gideon said. His tone was level. He'd heard enough about Renshaw by this point to have formed an opinion, though he'd never said it directly. Renshaw looked at the two of them standing together and let his gaze settle there for a moment. Not quickly, not subtly. He wanted them to know he was looking. "Well," he said, with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes, "good to see the two of you making the most of the market." "Were you looking to buy something?" Alara asked. "Just stopping to say hello."
He picked up one of the bridles from her table, looked at it, set it back down. Fine work. You've always had good hands. She didn't respond to that. He looked at Gideon. You thinking of staying on past the season? Calloway's operation is solid, but it's not big. Man with your skills might find himself wanting more. I'm happy where I am, Gideon said. For now, Renshaw said pleasantly. Men like you move around. I've seen it. No criticism. It's just the nature of the work. New places, new starts. He looked back at Alara with an expression of manufactured concern. It's a hard thing, building a life with someone whose work keeps moving him on. I don't recall asking for your observations, Alara said.
Just friendly conversation. He paused. Then, of course, there are other considerations. A man building a real future thinks about legacy, family. His voice was perfectly calibrated, not quite a sneer, not quite sympathy. Not every arrangement can offer a man that. The market around them hadn't gone entirely quiet, but it had gone careful. The people nearest the table, she was aware of 3, 4, 5 of them within easy hearing, had shifted into that particular stillness of people who were listening hard while pretending not to. She felt the blood come up in her face and she held it. 6 years of practice at holding exactly this response. Her jaw was tight. She was aware of Gideon to her right, very still. Renshaw was looking at her with the expression of a man who had just done what he came to do and was waiting to see the result. What I can't offer a man, she said, keeping her voice steady, is my business. What I can offer him is mine to decide, and what I decide has nothing to do with you. Of course not, he said. I just think, Clay. Gideon's voice was quiet, not raised, not threatening, just final, the way a closed door was final. You've said what you came to say. I think we're done here. Renshaw looked at him. Some recalculation happened behind his eyes. He'd expected the comment to land between them, to wedge something, and it hadn't landed that way, and he was adjusting to that. Just being neighborly, Renshaw said. I know what you were being, Gideon said. A beat. Renshaw looked at Gideon for a moment longer than necessary, and then he smiled, the real version of his smile, smaller and less pleasant than the performed one, and nodded once and walked away. The crowd around them eased back into its noise. Someone nearby started talking about feed prices. The market went on. Alara put both hands flat on the table and looked at the tack laid out in front of her and breathed through her nose. Are you all right? Gideon asked quietly. Yes. A pause. No. She breathed again. I'm angry. That's the right response. I hate that he did that in front of people. I know. I hate that it worked, that I could feel it working, people hearing it, thinking. She stopped. Alara. He moved slightly closer, not touching her, just reducing the distance. Look at me. She looked. Whatever he was trying to do, Gideon said, it didn't work. Not on me. Not on anyone here who actually knows you. It doesn't matter if it worked on you. It matters what people think. It matters what they tell each other, what they decide, what... It matters, he agreed. But it's not the thing that determines what's true. He held her gaze. What's true is what we decide it is, not him. She looked at him for a long moment. The anger was still there. It would be there for a while, she knew that about herself. But underneath it, something else was present. Something that had been building since the storm night, since February, since the gate had been unlatched and stayed that way. He's not going to stop, she said. Probably not. He wants the land. He wants me gone. Or, she thought about it, or diminished enough that people stop seeing me as someone who gets to decide what happens to it. I know. Gideon was quiet for a moment. Then, what do you want to do about it? She looked down at the table, at her hands, still flat on the wood, at the tack she'd repaired herself, the leather she'd worked until it was right, at 11 years of decisions made alone on a property that had asked everything of her and she'd given it. I want to keep my land, she said. I want to not let him make me smaller than I am. Then we don't let him. It's not that simple. It's not, he agreed, but it starts there. She straightened up. She looked out at the market, at the people moving through it, at Renshaw's back disappearing toward the north tables. She thought about what it meant to stand somewhere and not move. It was something she'd been good at for 11 years. Standing still on her land, not moving, weathering what came. She'd just been doing it alone. She looked at Gideon. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited. What he said about legacy, about family, it's going to be what people talk about. It's going to be what they think about when they see us together. And I want you to know that I'm aware of that, and I'm not— She found the words with difficulty. "I'm not going to pretend it doesn't cost you something. Being associated with me right now, in this town, with everything that's been said, I want you to know I see that." He looked at her with an expression she'd come to recognize, the one that meant he was taking something seriously. "I hear you," he said, "and I want you to hear this. I'm 36 years old, and I don't make decisions based on what a town expects of me. I never have. That's part of why I moved around for so long." He paused. "I stopped moving because I found something worth staying for. That hasn't changed because Clay Renshaw has ambitions about your fence line." She didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. She turned back to the table and straightened one of the bridles that didn't need straightening, and he stood beside her and drank his coffee, and the market went on around them. They sold the tack. They drove home in the late afternoon with the wagon lighter and the conversation lighter too, both of them processing the day in their own ways without demanding the other person do it at the same pace. When they reached her gate, she unlatched it, and he helped her bring in the unsold items and then said he needed to get back to Callaway before dark. At the gate, leaving, he stopped. "One more thing," he said. "What?" He reached into his jacket, the inside pocket, where he kept small things, and took out what he'd been working on that night during the blizzard. She recognized it now that she could see it fully. A length of braided leather, complex and careful work, the kind that took a long time to do right. He'd formed it into a loop, a bracelet, or a keepsake. The leather worked into a tight, even braid with two ends twisted back into the center. He held it out to her. She took it. It was warm from being in his jacket. The braid was even and tight, no loose ends, the leather supple and well-conditioned. "You made this during the storm," she said. "I started it before the storm," he said. "I finished it during." She looked at it in her hand. It was simple, and it was careful, and it was made by his hands over what must have been many hours, and she understood that it was not a casual thing. "Gideon, I'm not asking you for anything tonight," he said. "I'm just giving you that. You can do whatever you want with it." He paused. "But I want you to know that whenever you're ready, whenever that is, if it ever is, I intend to ask you properly, in my own way, not in the middle of a market with Renshaw 10 yards away." He met her eyes. "You deserve better than that." She closed her hand around the braid. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She stood at the gate in the late afternoon light with the braided leather in her closed fist and looked at him. And he looked back. And neither of them needed the moment to be anything more complicated than what it was. "Go," she said finally, "before it's dark." "I'll come by tomorrow," he said. "The gate will be unlatched," she said. He nodded and rode east toward the Callaway spread, and she watched him until the road bent away through the trees and she couldn't see him anymore. Then she went inside and sat at the table with the braided leather in her hands and looked at it for a long time in the last of the afternoon light. She turned it over. She ran her thumb along the braid, feeling where each length of leather crossed the next, the patience the work required, the attention. She thought about him sitting across from her during the blizzard, bent over this exact piece, his hands moving in the firelight while the storm came apart against the cabin walls. She thought about what he'd said. "Whenever you're ready, if it ever is." Not a demand, not an ultimatum, just a statement of intent, offered cleanly and then let go, left entirely in her hands, which was, she was beginning to understand, exactly who he was. She was not ready. She knew that. There were things still unresolved, conversations still unfinished, fears she hadn't fully mapped. She was not a woman who moved without knowing the ground under her feet, and the ground right now was still shifting, still finding its level. But she was aware, sitting at that table with the braided leather warm in her hands, that the future was not a fixed thing. She'd thought it was, for 6 years, and she'd been wrong. The physician in Billings had given her an uncertainty, and she'd turned it into a certainty, and she'd built everything after that on that foundation. All the careful distance, all the preemptive endings, all the gates she'd latched against things that hadn't yet proven dangerous. She'd been so busy protecting herself from a loss that hadn't happened yet that she'd created a different kind of loss, quieter and more complete. She set the braid on the table in front of her. She thought about the market, about Renshaw's face when he'd walked away, that small, knowing smile, about the crowd that had heard him and was even now probably talking about what it meant, building their version of the story. She thought about what Gideon had said. What's true is what we decide it is, not him. She picked up the braid again, held it. Outside, the last light was leaving the sky, and the first stars were appearing above the ridge, and her ranch was quiet and solid around her. The barn, the paddocks, the straight fence post she'd finally gotten right, the north gate standing unlatched in the dark. 11 years of her life in every piece of it. She was not going to let Clay Renshaw reduce that. Not the land, not her choices, not the things she was still learning the name for that lived in her chest when Gideon Mercer was within 20 feet of her. But there was something else still sitting in the back of her mind. Something she'd let herself almost forget during the warmth of February, during the gate unlatched and the mornings rebuilt, during the easy conversations and Duchess learning to stand still. The physician's words had been uncertain. He told her that directly. Certainty is difficult in these matters. 6 years ago, she hadn't known what to do with uncertainty, so she'd made it into certainty and lived there. But uncertain meant there was something still unknown. It meant the story she'd been telling herself might not be the complete story. She didn't let herself think too far down that road. She was practiced at not doing that, at not building on ground that hadn't been tested. But she was aware of the thought, the way you were aware of a door you hadn't opened, and it sat with her as she went about the evening's work, feeding the horses, checking the water, latching the barn. It sat with her when she went to bed. It was still there when she woke up. Some things were coming whether she was ready for them or not. The market had made that clear enough. Renshaw wasn't finished, the town wasn't done talking, and she and Gideon were standing somewhere that was about to require them both to stand more firmly or give ground they couldn't get back. She lay in the dark and ran her thumb along the braided leather she'd brought to bed with her, still in her hand, and she thought, all right, let's see what's true. The week after the market, Ilara drove to Billings. She didn't tell anyone she was going, not even Gideon. She woke before dawn on a Tuesday, hitched the wagon, and drove the 4 hours south on roads that were still half frozen in the early morning and muddy by noon. She didn't think too hard about why she was going or what she expected to find. She'd learned over the years that thinking too hard about a decision before you made it was often just another way of not making it. She found a physician's office on the main street, not Dr. Hale, who she had no particular desire to see again, but a younger doctor named Elias Rowan, whose name she'd gotten from Marta Delacroix, who'd used him the previous year for something complicated and said he was thorough and direct and didn't talk to women like they needed managing. The waiting room smelled like wood polish and tobacco. She sat in it for 40 minutes with her hat in her lap, watching 2 other women wait before her, and she thought about nothing in particular, which was getting easier to do now that she'd had some practice. Dr. Rowan was younger than she'd expected, early 40s, with a precise manner that wasn't cold, just economical, and the particular quality of attention of someone who'd learned to listen before he formed conclusions. He asked her to explain what she'd been told 6 years ago. She explained it. He listened without interrupting, made notes, and then was quiet for a moment. Did Dr. Hale perform an internal examination? He did. Did he use any imaging instruments? A speculum-based examination with dilation? I don't know the technical details. He examined me for quite a while. And his conclusion was permanent infertility based on visible scarring. He said probable. He said he wasn't certain. Dr. Rowan looked at his notes. That's an important word, he said. Probable. He said it was unlikely enough that he wanted to be direct with me. I understand why he was being direct. I also want to be direct with you. In 1882, the diagnostic tools available to assess reproductive scarring were substantially limited. A physician could observe certain things and infer others, but the conclusions drawn from those observations carried a significant margin of error. He looked at her over his notes. I'm not saying Dr. Hale was wrong. I'm saying he gave you his best assessment with the tools he had. Those tools were imprecise. She was very still. I'd like to examine you, he said.
with your consent. I have access to more current methods, and I'd like to give you an assessment that's based on what I can actually observe, not what a colleague observed 6 years ago with limited equipment." She said yes. She lay on the examination table in the white-walled room and stared at the ceiling and breathed steadily while he worked with the careful, impersonal efficiency of a doctor who understood that clinical attention was its own form of respect. It took 20 minutes. She counted the boards in the ceiling, 9 wide planks. The third one from the right had a darker grain, probably a different tree. When he was done, he washed his hands at the basin and she sat up and waited. "The scarring is present," he said. "That part Dr. Hale got right. You have adhesions in the left fallopian tube that are significant." He paused. "The right side, however, is substantially clear. There is no reason, based on what I can observe, to conclude that you cannot conceive. It may be more difficult. It may take longer. There may be complications I cannot predict, but a diagnosis of permanent, complete infertility is not supported by what I'm seeing." She sat on the edge of the table and looked at the floor. "Miss Ashcroft," he said, gently but without softening it into something it wasn't, "I want to be careful here. I'm not telling you that you will have children. I'm telling you that the certainty you were given 6 years ago was not warranted by the evidence. What you actually have is uncertainty, which is harder to live with in some ways and easier in others." She looked up. "Why didn't he tell me it was only one side?" He may not have been able to determine that clearly with the tools available, or he may have concluded that the damage to the left was severe enough to warrant the stronger warning. He folded his hands. "I'm not here to criticize a colleague. I'm here to tell you what I see." She got off the table. She straightened her clothes. She stood in the middle of the room for a moment, and the room was very quiet, and outside the window, Billings went about its afternoon business, entirely indifferent to what had just happened in here. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. She was surprised by that. "Do you have someone to talk to?" he asked. Not prying, just asking. "Yes," she said, and she realized, saying it, that it was true in a way it hadn't been 6 years ago. "I do." She didn't drive straight home. She stopped at a small place on the south edge of town and ate a meal alone at a corner table and looked out the window at the street and let the afternoon pass around her while she sat with everything Dr. Rowan had said. 6 years. She'd built 6 years of her life around a diagnosis that had been, at best, an informed guess made with limited information by a man doing his best with what he had. She didn't feel rage about it, which surprised her. She'd expected rage. She was a woman who knew how to be angry, who'd learned to use anger as a useful tool when softer responses failed. But what she felt sitting in that corner table was something more complicated than anger. She felt the specific grief of a person who'd spent years protecting themselves from a wound that had already, without their knowing, started to close. She'd made choices based on that wound. Real choices, with real consequences. Years of distance, years of latched gates, 6 winters of convincing herself that the responsible thing was also the right thing. She'd told herself she was protecting other people, and the truth was she'd also been protecting herself, building a life that couldn't be taken away because it was built for one person, accountable to nothing beyond what she could manage alone. And it had worked. It had been a safe life. It had just not been a whole one. She finished her meal and drove home in the dark, the wagon lantern throwing a small circle of light on the road ahead, the stars coming out above the mountains, the air cold and clean and, for the first time in a while, not quite as heavy as it had been. She told Gideon the next morning. He came through the unlatched gate at 7:30 and found her at the workbench, and she said, without preamble, "I went to Billings yesterday to see a doctor." He stopped. She told him everything. Dr. Rowan, the examination, the distinction between the left side and the right, the word probable that Dr. Hale had used 6 years ago, and what it actually meant. She told it straight, no drama, the way she told hard things, and he stood at the workbench and listened without interrupting, his eyes on her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "So the certainty you had," he said slowly, "wasn't certain." "No." "And you've been carrying it for 6 years like it was?" "Yes." He looked away briefly, at the barn, at the paddock, at something in the middle distance. His jaw was tight in a way she recognized as him processing something real. "I don't know what to do with that," he said honestly. Not in a bad way, just, I don't quite know yet. That's fair, she said. I don't either. He looked back at her. Does it change anything? For you? She thought about it carefully, because it deserved careful thought. It changes the facts, she said. It doesn't change what I decided during the blizzard. It doesn't change why the gate's been unlatched. She paused. I didn't go to Billings to come back with something to offer you. I went because I needed to know the truth. Whatever the truth was. He nodded slowly. Something in his face was working through something. And if the truth had been the same as what you'd been told, then I'd still be standing here, she said. He held her gaze, then he said quietly, I know. He reached into his jacket pocket. He took out the braided leather cuff, the one she'd left on her table 2 nights ago, the one she'd been picking up and setting down and picking up again since the market. He'd noticed it wasn't on her, she understood now. He'd picked it up from the table when she wasn't watching, or she'd left it behind when she went to Billings without meaning to. I said I was going to ask you properly, he said. In my own way. Gideon, let me finish. He turned the braid over in his hands, the same gesture she'd used. I'm not a man who has much to offer in the material sense. I have my work, and I have what I've saved, and I have the fact that I don't make commitments I don't intend to keep. He looked at her directly. I intend to keep this one, whatever it turns out to mean. Whatever comes and doesn't come. I want to be on your land in the mornings, and I want to come through that gate, and I want to sit at your table and drive into town with you and work next to you for as long as you'll have me. He held out the braid. Will you marry me? Not a question, quite. A statement offered for her to confirm or refuse. She looked at the braid. She looked at him. She thought about the examination table in Billings and the ceiling boards and the word uncertain and how she'd driven home in the dark and felt the weight lift, just a little, just enough. She took the braid from his hands and put it on her wrist where it belonged. Yes, she said. He exhaled. She hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath until he let it go, and that undid her slightly. The fact that he'd been nervous, that under all his steadiness he'd been genuinely uncertain, that he was human enough to be afraid of the answer. She reached out and put her hand against his jaw, and he turned into it slightly, just barely, and they stood like that in the cold morning air beside the workbench for a moment. Then she said, You're going to be late to Calloway. He'll manage, Gideon said. You should still go. I should, he agreed, and didn't move for another beat, and she was glad. What happened at the second market that spring, the late April gathering that Frost Hollow held, when the mud finally hardened enough to make travel reasonable, was not something either of them planned. They went together, same as March. Alara's table was near the center this time, and the morning started the same way, managing the table, moving through the crowd, the careful social navigation of a small town that was still sorting out its story about her. Gideon was with her, which people noted, and she let them note it. Renshaw appeared same as before, working the room in the same pattern. She'd been expecting him. She'd thought about what she would do when he appeared, and she'd come to no particular conclusion, which was unusual for her, and she'd decided to let the moment be what it was rather than prepare for it. He came to her table mid-morning, same easy confidence, same performed warmth. Alara, he said. He looked at Gideon. Mercer, still in the county, I see. Still in the county, Gideon said. Renshaw looked at this braid on Alara's wrist. He clocked it. She saw him clock it, and something moved behind his face. I heard you were in Billings recently, he said to Alara. I was, she said, checking in with the doctor. She met his eyes. I was. He tilted his head. And how did that go? She'd thought about this moment, or hadn't let herself think about it, and now it was here and she found the words without reaching for them. Dr. Rowan reviewed my records, she said clearly. He found that the original assessment was based on incomplete information. The original diagnosis was not supported by the evidence. She paused. The years of speculation in this town were built on something uncertain. The people around them, there were more this time because the market was busier and they were in the center of it, went to that careful stillness again. She was aware of Hattie Pruitt 12 feet to her left, very deliberately not looking over. She was aware of Tom Garrett and Mercy Aldane and 6 other faces she knew. Renshaw was quiet for a moment.
His expression stayed composed, but something underneath it had shifted. He'd built a play on specific information, and the information had just been publicly undercut. "Well," he said, "good news then." "The news," Gideon said, stepping forward just slightly, not aggressively, just present, just visible, "is that the story you've been telling about Alara wasn't accurate. And I think everyone here knows where that story came from." A silence, not a comfortable one. "I don't know what you're implying," Renshaw said. "I'm not implying anything," Gideon said. "I'm saying it directly. You've spent months trying to make Alara smaller than she is because you want her land, and you figured the easiest way to get it was to make people see her as someone who needed rescuing." He looked at Renshaw without anger, just steadiness, just the absolute refusal to be moved. It didn't work. Renshaw looked at the people around them. He looked at Alara. He looked at Gideon. Then he looked at the braid on her wrist. "Congratulations," he said, and walked away. It wasn't a defeat that announced itself. He didn't storm off. He didn't make a scene. He just left, the way powerful men left when a play hadn't worked, calmly, already recalculating, because men like Renshaw always recalculated. He would try something else, eventually. She knew that. But something had shifted in the room, in the people who had heard what was said, and that shift would take time to reverse, if it ever did. Hattie Pruitt appeared at her elbow. "Well," Hattie said, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had been waiting a long time for a specific thing to happen. "About time." "Don't," Alara said. "I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying." Hattie looked at the braid. She looked at Gideon. She looked at Alara with the expression of someone who'd known the end of a story before the people in it had. "You're going to be all right," she said, quietly, without performance. "The both of you." Alara looked at her. "I know," she said. Jen. They married in June on the Ashcroft property, on a morning that was clear and warm with a west wind coming off the mountains. There was no ceremony that required much. A justice of the peace from Frost Hollow named Aldous Birch, who conducted the thing with brisk efficiency and genuine warmth, about 30 people who came because they wanted to rather than because it was required, and a table set up in the yard with food that various neighbors had contributed without being asked. It was not a perfect day. The wind knocked over the flower arrangement Marta Delacroix had spent an hour setting up. One of the horses got loose during the vows, and Alara had to fight the urge to go after it. Gideon was so nervous in the minutes before that he spilled coffee down his shirt and had to change, and he laughed at himself for it, which made her feel better about being nervous too. But Aldous Birch asked if they took each other, and they said yes, both of them looking at each other with the particular expression of people who had worked hard to get somewhere and knew what the work had cost. And then it was done. And it was real. And the people around them made the kind of noise that people made at real things. Hattie Pruitt cried. She denied this immediately when anyone looked at her and claimed the wind had gotten in her eyes, which nobody believed. That fall, a boy turned up. He was 8 years old, give or take. He didn't know his own birthday with any precision, which told you most of what you needed to know. His name was apparently Thomas, or Tommy, though he answered to neither with much consistency. He'd been found 2 weeks earlier on the road between Frost Hollow and the neighboring county by a rancher named Debs, who couldn't keep him and had brought him to the town's attention as a problem requiring solving. The town had been passing him around, person to person, well-intentioned and temporary, for 2 weeks. He appeared at Alara's gate on a Wednesday afternoon, brought by Mercy Aldane from the post office, who had run out of people to ask and had decided, apparently, that the Ashcroft Mercer property was a reasonable last resort. He was thin in the way of children who'd been thin for a long time, so it looked ordinary on him. He had dark hair that needed cutting and eyes that had learned to measure spaces before he entered them, an old habit in a young face. Alara looked at him for a moment. "What's your name?" she asked. "Tommy," he said. Then, "Thomas. I don't care which." "Are you hungry, Thomas?" He considered whether honesty was safe. Decided it was. "Yes." "Come in," she said. Gideon was in the barn when she brought him inside and came to the door to see what was happening. He looked at the boy. He looked at Alara. She raised her eyebrows slightly, which they'd developed a language for. This eyebrow meant, "I'll explain later. Go with it for now."
He went with it.
Thomas ate a considerable amount of food for a boy his size and answered questions in the careful way of someone who'd learned that information was a kind of currency that could be spent wrong. He'd been traveling with his father, who had died in January of an illness that had come on fast. He'd been with a family in the next county until April, when their own circumstances had changed. Since then, he'd been, as he put it with 8-year-old bluntness, mostly finding my own way. "You've been alone since April?" Gideon asked. "Mostly," Thomas said. "People let me work sometimes. I'm good with horses." Gideon looked at Alara again. That night, after Thomas was asleep in the storage room on the cot that had held Gideon during 2 different blizzards, they sat at the table and talked about it in low voices. "Mercy has nowhere else for him," Alara said. "I gathered that. He's good. He's careful. He's not a difficult child. He's just a child who's had difficult things happen." Gideon looked at her steadily. "Are you asking me or telling me?" She thought about it. "Asking." He was quiet for a moment. "Then yes," he said. Thomas stayed. He was not an easy child in the way that children who'd spent time surviving without adults were not easy. He had his own systems, his own methods, his own particular ideas about how things should be done, and he didn't abandon them quickly in favor of anyone else's. He tested Gideon the way children tested the adults, who seemed most likely to leave, pushing at the edges to find where the limit was. And Gideon held the limits without making them punishments, which Thomas eventually understood was a form of consistency he hadn't had much access to. He was, as he'd claimed, genuinely good with horses. Alara put him to work with Duchess within the first week and watched the 2 of them, the recovered mare and the careful boy, approach each other with the mutual recognition of creatures who understood what it meant to have been handled badly. By the end of October, Thomas was brushing Duchess every morning without being asked, and Duchess stood for it with complete stillness, and Alara watched from the paddock fence and felt something she didn't quite have a word for. She was aware, that fall, of something else. A tiredness that wasn't the usual kind. A change in her body that was subtle at first and then less subtle, that she filed away and waited on because she had learned, painfully, thoroughly, not to build on ground before she'd tested it. She went back to Dr. Rowan in October. He confirmed what she'd suspected with the manner of a man delivering news that was real and required being treated as real, not performed as miraculous. "You're approximately 10 weeks along," he said. "There will be risks, given the history. The left tube is still a concern. You'll need to be seen regularly." He looked at her. "But the pregnancy is viable. Right now, today, it is viable." She drove home in October the same way she'd driven home in March. Alone, the mountains on either side, the road running straight ahead. But this time the weight she was carrying wasn't grief. It was something she hadn't carried before in this particular form, and it was heavier than grief in some ways, and lighter in others. She found Gideon in the barn with Thomas, both of them working on a bridle repair. The boy focused and quiet, Gideon explaining something in the low, patient voice he used when he was teaching. She stood in the barn doorway for a moment watching them, and neither of them noticed her yet. Then Gideon looked up. He read her face, too. He'd gotten good at that, and something moved across his own. "Thomas," he said, "go check the water in the second paddock." Thomas went, casting a brief measuring look at Alara as he passed. She walked into the barn and stood in front of Gideon and told him. She told it the same way she told him things, directly, with the caveats included, because she was not a woman who softened true things into comfortable ones. "Rowan says viable," she said. "Risks, because of the left side. I'll need to be watched closely. He can't promise me anything past today." Gideon stood very still. "But today," she said, "it's real." He crossed the space between them and put his arms around her, and she let him, which was something that had taken months to become natural and was now simply what it was. She felt him breathe. She felt the specific quality of relief in someone who'd been holding something carefully for a long time and was being told they could set it down. "Are you all right?" he asked into her hair. "I'm scared," she said. "Me too. I don't want to build too much on it. I don't know how to not build too much on it." "We'll build it carefully," he said. "Same as everything else." She pulled back and looked at him. He looked back. They were both themselves, imperfect, wary, shaped by things that had happened to them before they found each other.
carrying histories that didn't disappear because something good had arrived. That was the truth of it. That had always been the truth of it. Thomas is going to have opinions about this, she said. Gideon laughed. An actual laugh surprised out of him. He's going to have very detailed opinions about this. Thomas did. The child was born the following spring on a morning that was cold and clear, with Marta Delacroix present as midwife and Gideon in the outer room waiting in the particular agony of people who were doing the hardest possible thing, which was letting someone else carry the weight for a while. It was not an easy birth. There were hours in the middle of the night that were frightening in ways Alara didn't want to examine too closely afterward. Marta worked with the steadiness of a woman who'd seen difficult things and hadn't been beaten by them, and Alara worked the way she worked at everything. Without panic, one thing at a time, because panic was expensive. By morning, they had a daughter. She was small and loud and looked, in Gideon's opinion, considerably more like herself than like either of her parents, which he said to the room and which made Marta Delacroix laugh and Alara roll her eyes. And Thomas, who had been allowed in after, examined the baby with an expression of intense critical assessment. She's very small, Thomas said. She'll get bigger, Alara said. How long does that take? Longer than you'll want to wait. Thomas considered this. She can have the stall next to Duchess, he said, with the air of someone making a substantial concession, when she's old enough to come to the barn. That's very generous, Gideon said gravely. Thomas nodded and went outside to do the morning feeding, because someone had to. Well, the story of Alara Ashcroft and what she built on the property east of Frost Hollow does not end with any single moment. That is the honest truth of it. It keeps going the way real things keep going, uneven and unglamorous, with the problems that didn't get resolved in the winter getting picked up again in the spring, with Renshaw making 2 more attempts on the land over the following years and being denied both times, with Thomas growing into a young man who was difficult and precise and deeply attached to both the place and the people in it, with a second child born when Alara was 34 and survived without the complications of the first. What Clay Renshaw never understood, and what Frost Hollow eventually came to understand, was that the woman he'd tried to diminish had never needed the town's approval to stand on her own land. She'd stood there for 11 years before anyone paid particular attention to how she was doing it. The approval, when it came, was welcome. But it wasn't the thing that kept her standing. The thing Alara understood, that she'd arrived at slowly and with considerable cost, was this. The decisions you made about your own worth were not made in the big moments. They were made in the small ones, in whether you latched the gate or left it open, in whether you let someone help you carry something or told them you were fine when you weren't, in whether you gave uncertainty the same weight you'd been giving certainty, in whether you let a person know what they meant to you before the blizzard made it unavoidable. She'd spent 6 years being responsible in ways that were actually just fear, wearing the face of responsibility. She'd called it protection, and it had been, in part, but it had also been a way of making herself smaller than she was, preemptively, so that no one else got the chance to do it to her first. That was the hardest thing to admit. Harder than the diagnosis. Harder than the years alone. Harder than standing at the market while Renshaw dismantled her in front of the town. The hardest thing was understanding that she had been her own most effective opposition for a long time. And the thing that changed it was not a dramatic reversal. It was not a blizzard or a doctor's office or a man saying the right words at the right time. It was the accumulation of small decisions she made when she was tired of the alternative, the gate left unlatched, the truth told out loud in the dark, the hand extended rather than withheld. Gideon understood this about her without her having to explain it, which was how she'd known, eventually, that he was the right person to stand next to. Not because he was perfect, he was not, and she would be the first to provide a detailed accounting of his particular failures and blind spots, but because he saw the actual person, not the story someone had built around her, not the diagnosis, not the land or what it was worth. Just her. Just the woman who rebuilt broken fences and kept her horses through hard winters, and occasionally, when she let herself, looked up at the mountains and found them beautiful. Decades later, when Thomas's own children came to the ranch and ran between the paddocks and climbed the fence rails, and made the particular noise of children who felt completely safe somewhere, Alara would stand at the workbench under the overhang where she'd been standing.
The first morning, she looked up from a fence post and watched a stranger ride past on the county road, and she would think about the 25-year-old woman who'd sat in a doctor's office in Billings and decided what her life was worth. She would think, "You were wrong." Not harshly, with something more like tenderness for that younger version of herself who'd done the best she knew how with what she had, who'd protected herself the only way she'd learned, who'd built something real and solid even inside all that careful distance, because that was simply her nature, the thing that couldn't be suppressed even when she was trying to make herself smaller. She would look at the north gate, which no longer had the deliberate significance it once had, which was just a gate now, as ordinary as everything else on the property. She would look at Gideon, older, a little gray at the temples, coming out of the barn with Thomas's oldest daughter on his shoulders, both of them laughing at something. She would look at this life she had, imperfect and ongoing and costing her something every day in the best possible way, because things that cost you something meant you were genuinely in them, genuinely present, genuinely alive to what was happening, rather than managing it from a careful distance. The greatest thing she had ever done was not holding on. It was learning, finally, after a long time, to let go of what she'd decided was impossible and see what was actually there. The mountains had watched all of it. The blizzards, the arguments, the mornings that went wrong, the ones that didn't. They didn't care. They were mountains. But the ranch at their feet had become something real, something that held people and gave them warmth and asked only that you work honestly and show up when you said you would. That was enough. It had always been enough. She just had to live long enough and be wrong enough and be brave enough on enough ordinary mornings to finally know it.